Hello, members, and welcome to our program today with Dr. Richard Haass, the President of the Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Marianne Maldonado, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program. We're honored today to bring you this members-only exclusive with Dr. Richard Haass, President on the Council of Foreign Relations, and together in conversation with the Council's Ronan O'Malley, they will discuss his new book, The World, A Brief Introduction, and the complexities of foreign relations during these tenuous times. Over the past few months, our thoughts are with each one of our council members. We worked hard to continue to bring you these amazing speakers, such as today's talk with Dr. Haass, and we thank you for your ongoing participation and support. It is our hope that you and your families are doing well. Before we begin, I'd like to highlight some of our upcoming speakers. Tomorrow, be sure to tune in to our Young Professionals Local to Global program on the mastery of negotiation. And next week, I will host a conversation with Elliot Ackerman, the former Marine and intelligence officer who served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan and received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. Later this month, we will feature the Dean of the School of Foreign Service in Georgetown University, and our special guest in August is economist and political commentator Bob Reich. Also, don't miss all of our recent conversations with our 2020 Jesse H. Jones Recognized Global Leaders of Influence, available now. Also, and our live celebration with our 2020 International Citizen of the Year, Noble Energy's Chairman and CEO, Dave Stover, available on August 13th, right here on this YouTube channel. So be sure to click the subscribe button on your YouTube channel to stay engaged and be connected with the World Affairs Council. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome back to the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, Dr. Richard Haass. Dr. Haass is a prominent voice on American policy. Currently, his 17th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan think tank, publisher, and educational institution, and someone very, very familiar to the membership here at the Houston Council. Joined by Ronan, Dr. Haass, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It's great to be back. And let me just also echo what you said. It's obviously a difficult time for so many of the people in the Houston area and throughout Texas. And we've been through it in New York, and we both sympathize and empathize and look forward to your getting to the other end of that tunnel.
Well, thank you again, Marianne, and thank you very much, Dr. Haass. It's wonderful to host you. You have long been one of not just the most popular, but definitely one of the most illuminating and engaging speakers we've had. So our members were delighted to have you back. We hope at some point to have you again, hopefully in person. And you also want to thank you again for your incredible diplomatic career. A lot of our members know about it at the forefront of some of the United States' kind of most difficult, but also some of our most effective foreign policy challenges. And I just want to say thank you, for your service and your influence in kind of shaping the discussion for the United States. And the book is a wonderful premise for that. Maybe you could just talk briefly about, you mentioned it in the preface, why it is you took on this project, which is an incredibly big endeavor, going from 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, basically through today, and mention every framework and structure and major issue impacting the world today. What it was that you kind of inspired you to do it, and what do you hope people get from it?
Basically asking why I undertook this modest project.
Yeah.
To code that. Look, we're living at a time, and we see it every day, where the world is objectively central to our lives. Right now, it's the effects of something that began in Wuhan, China, and came here on 9/11. It was terrorists operating in Afghanistan. Every day, it's climate change, or trade, or investment, or travel. At least in the days we used to travel. So the world is central, and I was struck by the contrast between the objective importance of the world and how little many people in this country and around the world actually understood that. There's a large gap. And I'm a Jeffersonian, and I'm a great believer that democracy depends upon an informed citizenry. So when people go to vote this November, I want them to be aware of the issues and understand the differences between whether it's the presidential candidates, Senate candidates, House of Representatives. I want them to hold elected officials to account after elections. I want them to make good choices about careers, investments, business, travel, what have you. And for all of this, you need a foundation. Problem is, you can go to virtually any university or college or high school in this country. And in many cases, the courses are offered, but almost none of them are they required. What led to this book in some ways was this young man going to Stanford, and he was a year away from graduating, and he was going to leave that university with a degree in computer sciences, but essentially was going to be illiterate about the world that he was entering was going to affect his life. And a lot of people don't even go to college. If you watch the nightly news, you're not going to pick up much in this. The internet has lots of this. On the other hand, there's no one there to tell you what to believe in, what's real, what's accurate, how to make it systematic. So I took on the challenge of basically providing what one would call a primer in Britain, a primer here, but essentially a basic book to give people the foundation and to help them navigate the choices, the decisions, the information that's coming at them. And I try to do it in a way that didn't assume a lot of background, didn't assume they had read all sorts of other things. They could be computer majors or flute majors. I don't assume this is what they're going to do for their life. But again, I believe all of us need to know more about this world that one way or another is going to affect our security, our prosperity, essentially every aspect of our life.
And there's so much in this book. We obviously won't be able to touch upon all of it, but maybe just a few key components. I will maybe just mention 1648, why you kind of chose that time. A lot of historians and political science choose that time. The end of 30 Years' War, and really providing the underbearing structure eventually comes through today's order or degree of order. Why was it so unique and different that the idea of sovereignty and respect for borders and relatively the need to not interfere in others within their internal borders, why was that so unique, and how is it that it still influences today?
Well, you set it up exactly right. It was a big innovation. The idea that borders would be respected, not just against invading armies, but people wouldn't interfere in the internal workings of other entities. And it may sound fairly basic or prosaic, but it was a big, big innovation of the time. You had really constant interference, constant conflict. Now, obviously, when one looks at the several hundred years since then, this principle has been violated. But often it has also been recognized and observed, and we're an awful lot better when it is observed. Indeed, we've reached a point in history where the violations of it are much more noticeable, respect for it. So I basically think the rise of a modern state system, the rise of a modern international order, in many ways can be traced back to the mid-17th century. That's in some ways the starting point, the foundation stones of what was grown up now. And I think the challenge for our own time, skipping ahead now 300 or so, 400 years, is we need to keep the best parts of that. We don't want to have a world, again, where people violate one another's borders with impunity. We saw recently what happened, say, in Ukraine when Russia went in. We saw when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait 30 years ago. We've seen Russian interference in our political processes. So we don't want to have a world where this principle breaks down. But, and it's a big but, it's also not enough. And what I've been saying is, as we learned, say, on 9/11, we can respect the sovereignty at that point of Afghanistan, but if you have terrorists operating out of a country, that raises all sorts of questions. Or now Brazil is destroying its rainforest. The Amazon is largely within Brazil's borders, but that has consequences for all of us. Climate change, obviously, but respects no borders. Or what happened in Wuhan, a virus breaks out. China didn't meet its international obligations. That has consequences for the United States and other countries. So I think the one way to think about the intellectual and diplomatic challenge of this moment is how do we preserve the good side of sovereignty, the good dimension? On the other hand, make countries understand that with these rights come obligations. And if you don't meet some of those obligations, you can't expect to benefit from all the rights. And that, to me, is one way to structure the diplomatic and intellectual challenge for living in this global world we live in.
And as you note in the book, the last few decades, definitely there have been great reasons be optimistic of increased degree of democracy, or at least democratic forces in a lot of different parts of the world, but also, the rise of kind of quasi-democratic institutions or states. Is there a difficulty for anybody when you're living in an era to be able to recognize and acknowledge that history doesn't stop? Forces are still going on, changes are still taking place. The rise of autocracy in China or Russia or Turkey or the Philippines. Is that a difficult thing for people to understand at the time as it's happening?
I have two reactions to it. It's 30 years since Frank Fukuyama wrote his important essay, The End of History. And whatever else has happened in these 30 years, history didn't end. And if he were here, he would refine his argument and say what he meant and how he was misinterpreted. But I think it's an important realization that wonderful moment, the end of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Empire unraveled, the German unification within NATO, that extraordinary moment, that was simply a point on the arc of history. And there was things that led up to it, and there's things that followed on from it. And in that sense, history is really understood as a process, and there's no culmination. There's no end point. So that's point one. My other point is there are times in my career, I've been at this now for roughly 4 decades, and I get up in the morning and I go to work at the Pentagon or the State Department, the White House, what have you. You sort of knew what was set on the table, and you knew the range of issues that you would have to deal with. What's so interesting now, Ronan, is I actually feel for the first time in some ways in my career that we're living in history. That what's up for grabs is not plus or minus 5%, but rather a lot of, essentially the whole thing is up for grabs. Things could go in fundamentally different directions in terms of this pandemic, in terms of climate change, in terms of US-Chinese relations. In some ways, I feel, you mentioned 1648, I feel I'm almost back at Oxford when I was studying international relations and studying diplomatic history. And I feel we're at one of those big, big moments in history where, to use another perspective, it's about 3/4 of a century since the end of World War II. And since the end of World War II, we've had a set of institutions and arrangements, American leadership in the world, and it's been a remarkable run. I'm hard-pressed as a historian to think of any other period that's lasted this long, that's been so good. No great power conflict. Prosperity has gone up around the world remarkably. Literally billions of people have been lifted out of poverty. The average lifespan has increased by a decade in this country and several decades in other parts of the world. Democracy has flourished for the most part over these 75 years. And the question is, has that period of history essentially run out of steam? And was it a wonderful period, but something of an aberration? And now we're going to go back to something darker or more turbulent? Or can we find ways of extending it or even building on it to deal with some of these new global challenges? So actually, and I don't know the answer to that question. I'm smart enough to pose the question. I'm not smart enough to answer it. But that's where I feel we are. I actually feel that decisions that will be made in the next few years have the potential to be truly consequential.
And various people talk about it, whether it's Obama not acting on a red line in Syria, or Trump's kind of withdrawing from major treaty agreements, whether TPP or Paris Climate Accords, anything like that. Are you concerned that if the U.S. continues to step back from global leadership, that as you conclude your section on global history, instead of it having an era of kind of continued relative peace, that we have a much more like an era of deterioration where no nation or group has an effective global leadership?
The short answer to your question, which was really an insight, is yes. My previous book was called A World in Disarray, and one of the principal reasons for the growing disarray in the world was the increasing reluctance of the United States to fulfill its post-World War II role. And I often describe us, we were both the principal architect and the general contractor of the world. Good news, we had all sorts of partners, other people on the work side, our allies in Europe, in Asia, but it was an extraordinary accomplishment. And in some ways, the biggest strategic change of the last 5 years, say, towards the end of the Obama administration, and it's accelerated in this administration, is what I've described as American abdication. That we've pulled back. We've essentially decided, for various reasons, that we don't want to do much of this anymore. think a lot of the reasons that have led us to do this are wrong, but my point is simply a lot of people disagree with me. They think these reasons are valid. And so there is a pattern of American pulling back from institutions, from alliances, even phrases like America First send all sorts of signals to the rest of the world. And my concern is that without us, the natural state of things is not order, it's not organization, but things will begin to come apart. Global challenges will not be met. Regional dangers will grow. And at the end, we will be one of the big losers of it, which is the tragedy and the irony of it. One of the big arguments put forward for the United States doing less is so much of what we do in the world is allegedly wasteful. We should be focusing here more at home. And I'm all for focusing on things at home, but we already spend a lot more than on every person in the United States. We spend much more on healthcare than the average person, say, in Europe. We spend almost twice as much. And last I checked, we don't live twice as long. We spend as much more on education. Our educational performance in K through 12 is not better. You can blame the Iraq War for many things, but you can't blame it for the state of our bridges or our airports. So, it's not clear to me that doing less in the world will help us here at home. But what is clear, that doing less in the world will lead to a deterioration of the world. And as we see now, when the world begins to unravel, we're not immune from it. One way or another, things get on the highway of globalization and find us. If there's a message in this book is not an argument. It's meant to be a primer. But there's two things, though, that flow through the book that are pervasive. One is that the world matters and that isolationism is folly, that we can hide from the world, but the world will find us. The second is that unilateralism is not the way to engage with the world. There's nothing we can do better on our own than we can do with others. So what I want people to come away from the book is to understand the world. And basically, I want them to internalize those 2 points. We've got to be involved in the world. Isolationism is a dead end. And we need to find partners. The good news, by the way, is we have all sorts of partners. The United States gets up in the morning. We've got dozens of partners in Europe and Asia who are willing and able to work with us.
And, unfortunately, if there is a kind of increased, leaning towards autocracy, at least in some significant powers. At one point in the book, you mentioned that American presidents throughout history have perhaps had too much confidence in the ability to develop a personal relationship with a dictator or an autocrat. And do you think that something that's been true kind of in recent years, whether it be Obama hoping to have a reset with Putin or, Trump obviously with Kim in North Korea? And if a personal relation like that's not realistic, what's the best way to approach and deal with autocracy?
Look, every president, to one degree or another, succumbs to this. It's a kind of vanity. FDR would talk about his ability to deal with Stalin. W talked about looking into Putin's soul. I think Trump has raised it to a new level with Kim, with Xi Jinping in China, with Putin, with Erdogan, and others. Look, I've been involved in all sorts of negotiations and diplomacy in the course of my career. I don't think personal relations matter for a whole lot of anything. Maybe the last 1% at the margins. But there's no foreign leader who's going to remain a foreign leader who gets about diplomacy to do us favors because he likes us. He might do compromise because he trusts us, respects us, fears us, all those things, but not because he likes us. And personal relationships are so exaggerated. It's also dangerous. One of the things that we've gotten into trouble in the last few years is putting too much emphasis on personal relationships, for example, on summitry. Well, unless summits are carefully prepared and the table is set and so forth, but at best they'll do nothing and at worst they'll be steps backward. Again, so I think the personal dimension of diplomacy and foreign policy tends to be exaggerated. Countries work on the basis of interests, perceptions, and again, most presidents, I think, would be good to jettison this notion that somehow there's magic in the chemistry between them and their foreign counterparts. Bernard, I don't know if you're frozen or I'm frozen, but I'm not hearing anything, and I don't know if you are.
Yeah, his video is a bit slow. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, Richard, I don't know if we got cut off. Did we get cut off?
You were in a space there, somewhere on the planet Zod for about a minute or a minute.
Okay. Sorry. And AT&T was just here yesterday and this morning. They told me everything was fixed. But I guess just a question on NATO and I suppose where it goes from here. Obviously, an incredibly successful alliance in many, many ways. But there are some people like yourself, you mentioned that perhaps the overexpansion of it upset the Russians unnecessarily. But there are others who would say if NATO hadn't expanded, maybe what Putin did in Crimea, he would have done in the Baltics or somewhere else. How do you see kind of the current state of NATO and really the future of it, especially if the United States is not taking a bigger role in leading it?
When the Cold War ended, I think there was a legitimate debate, even before the NATO enlargement debate, about whether NATO. And there was the question of whether you still wanted it or needed it. We decided to keep it around, largely to do things outside of Europe, to help consolidate the new democracies. Turned out it was a fairly valuable hedge against the resurfacing of Russian aggression. So I think the question of NATO's relevance has been settled by Vladimir Putin. So we need it. We should strengthen it. I don't think we need to grow it, but I do think we should strengthen it. I don't want Mr. Putin to be tempted to do to a NATO country, what he's done to Ukraine or Georgia. I think Mr. Trump has increased the odds of that, however, by introducing uncertainty about American reliability and predictability, about our honoring of so-called Article 5. And uncertainty is corrosive when it comes to alliances. But these countries, putting aside NATO for a second, let me say two other things about Europe. One is these countries in Europe are our best pool of partners to deal with global challenges, whether it's the rise of China, the British decision, for example, yesterday to forego Huawei on the 5G front, just shows how Europe will be very important in pushing back against China. If we are ever going to do anything on climate or on dealing with cyberspace, it's going to be in partnership with the Europeans, reforming the World Health Organization, and so forth. One other thing, the European project, the other side of Europe, coming out of World War II, there were two great initiatives in Europe. One was NATO, you just mentioned, Ron. The other was what was called the Coal and Steel Community, became the European Community, now is the European Union. And this is, it's brought peace and prosperity and solidified democracy in Europe. This has been the golden age. I said before, it's been the golden age of the world, first 3/4 of the century. It's been the golden age in Europe, and the two are connected, since Europe was often the principal venue of conflict in the first half of the 20th century. And it looked like the European project was beginning to come apart with Brexit. And what's been so interesting about the last month or two, and there's not a lot of silver linings to this pandemic, but one of the few good things that's happened in the world is how the European Union seems to have been in some ways revived by it. We see France and Germany working with the European Central Bank, working with the European Commission, and suddenly we see a much more imaginative, active, forward-leading Europe. And we'll see, the devil's in the details. We'll see what happens over future months and years. But there's a degree of economic activism and political collaboration that we haven't seen in years. So I'm quite encouraged by at least that aspect of what's going on in the world in the last few months. So by and large, I am not associated with anything to do with optimism or anything positive. But I will say what's going on in Europe, I think, is something of a bright spot.
Got to take what we can, right now.
Yes, sir.
And again, I would highly recommend this book. Is incredible, a great resource for anyone who just wants to know more about the world, or even if someone who feels pretty well informed. It's excellent to have it all put together and codified in a nice, easy format. You touch upon so many great, important subjects, whether it be from trade to immigration to climate change. Maybe I'll just ask 2 or 3 more questions and I'll turn it over to the audience because there's so much in the book. I think people themselves, you need to get it yourself and read it. And I highly recommend it for any student in high school or college or grad school who's interested in an international field, whatever it might be, whether it's, actual diplomacy or say international business or NGOs. But maybe just we could talk about the issue of nuclear proliferation. You talk about proliferation in general, but specifically nuclear proliferation. You say, like a lot of people say, probably to take a kind of realistic perspective, that for certain regimes, especially if they view it as key to their survival, that it'll be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to prevent them from getting nuclear weapons, whether that be North Korea or Iran, perhaps in a few years. So would the flip side of that be that you'd be a proponent of, in reality, just that we need to work on degrees of containment because stopping them is probably unrealistic?
There's 3 things that worry me with nuclear weapons these days. One is the revival of U.S.-Russian nuclear arms racing, and whoever's elected in February, he's going to have to decide what he does with the expiring New START agreement. And there's not enough time to negotiate a new one, so I would hope the existing agreement would be extended, and then during that time, the United States and Russia could talk about terms, maybe a complementary or successor agreement. I'm worried about nuclear use, particularly in the case of India-Pakistan, really fragile or brittle relationship, and it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see a conflict starting and potentially escalating. And the third is what's usually meant by nuclear proliferation. The 2 big issues are North Korea and Iran. Well, North Korea is there. They've proliferated. And the question is, can we put a ceiling on it and roll it back? I don't know, but I can tell you one thing. We're not going to accomplish it by calling for denuclearization. That's disarmament. That can be a goal. But what we have to think about are smaller steps. I don't know if North Korea is willing to take them. History wouldn't suggest a lot of optimism, but I think that ought to be our approach, where we would link specific sanctions relief to specific steps on their part that would then have to be obviously verified. But this approach, symmetry and grandiose schemes, sure ain't working. Iran, I haven't given up on. To the contrary, I'm actually determined that Iran not get nuclear weapons. I think if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it would be a nightmare. It's already the most dangerous country in the region. And let's not kid ourselves. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey might be tempted, and more than tempted, to follow suit. And just when you thought the Middle East couldn't get a lot worse, guess what? It can. So I think it's important that Iran not only not get nuclear weapons, not get real close to them. And again, the new president, whether it's Mr. Trump in the second term or Mr. Biden's going to have to decide what to do about that. The Iran nuclear agreement, the 2015 agreement, important aspects of it begin to expire in a couple of years. So I myself, we can have an argument of whether it was a good agreement. My own view, it was imperfect. That said, I would not have supported unilateral withdrawal. We've done it. But the answer at this point is not just to get back in, because that only buys you a couple of years. We have got to have an open-ended situation where Iran does not develop nuclear weapons or put into place all the prerequisites. And that has to be a goal of the United States. And I would make that one of our priorities with France, Britain, and Germany, is to basically think of a follow-on agreement. And again, it will require a negotiation where we ask certain things of Iran, and only if we get them and we can verify them would we agree to offer up any degree of sanction.
Okay. Thank you for that. And maybe just touch upon something, obviously, with tariffs and trade wars and all that, the issues of globalization and trade, you talk about a lot of, and, asking people to kind of look more closely at the numbers, or, realizing, say, the deficit the United States might have with somebody could be considerably lower when you count the actual value added by products made in the United States and whatnot. But you also talk about, I suppose, the term fair trade. I think a lot of people 20 years ago might have thought fair trade, they're thinking about a coca grower, in the Ivory Coast or Liberia and treating those people fairly. But it's come on in bigger, kind of broader international terms, this idea of fair trade. But you and others have a concern that fair trade might just become a euphemism for protectionism.
Look, it's very hard to stand against fair trade. It's a hard debate to win. Who can be against fairness? it all depends on what your definition of fair trade is. Does it, if for a lot of people, it seems to mean certain outcomes where trade is imbalanced. Well, that's not fair trade. And that might require denying the ability to import or export. To me, fairness in trade is things like you don't manipulate currencies, you don't have non-tariff barriers. Essentially, you have a level playing field. And then I'm not against imports. Imports in many cases can be wonderful. They can increase choice, quality, lower inflation, and so forth. They can stimulate innovation. So, in that sense, so I think we just have to be careful with the with the terms about what it is what we want. But in general, I think trade is a good thing. Trade gets blamed. Can I say one other thing? It tends to get blamed for job loss and closure of factories. And in a small percentage of cases, that's true. But probably 90% plus or minus of the jobs that are now lost are not from trade. It's from productivity increases. It's from innovation. It's from technology. And that's not stopping. That's robotics. That is artificial intelligence. And I think this is, if anything, is going to accelerate coming out of this pandemic, because manufacturers are going to look for ways to reduce the human element in manufacturing, since people can get sick, or you might have to keep them 6 feet apart or whatever. So I think it's important to stop blaming trade for what is the inexorable march of technology. And what we really have to think about is, how do we reskill? How do we educate? How do we train our workers? So when the jobs they currently have are eliminated, they are ready then to step into the next job that might use some of these new technologies. And this is something we've really got to get better at as a country. Because think about it, if there's someone here listening or watching this, if they're in their 20s, over the next 40, 50 years, they may have 15 jobs. No one's going to have just one job anymore. And they're gonna have to, at various stages in their life and career, top off their intellectual tank. They're going to have to learn a new set of skills in order to be prepared for the new opportunity that comes along. And the answer to this is not to oppose imports. It's not to be against trade. It's to be in favor of education and training.
And just maybe one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. So if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A section. You'll see the tab there at the bottom of the screen. Towards the end of your book that a lot of people talk about how continued interdependence of nations, especially with trade, can hopefully lead to the less likelihood of outbreak and war, all that. But you say in a lot of ways, again, not to get back to something pessimistic, but you're less optimistic about that certainty, and that you believe, and maybe you could explain why, that in reality, the true nature for the relative reduction in the amount of war since World War II has been because of the global order, because of the policies pursued, and in a lot of ways because of the entire structure that we've created. And I guess, how concerned are you about that? And unfortunately, the opportunities for the rise of war, whether it be civil wars, obviously, but internations wars, if the United States continues to step back from global leadership.
Good question. Look, there is a school of thought that economic interdependence discourages war, because if you are benefiting from trade, investment, and the rest, you're not going to want to upset the apple cart. I think that's true, everything else being equal, but we live in a world where everything else isn't equal. So for a country like China, they may be reluctant to have conflict because they want to continue to have trade and investment flows and the rest. But if they believe that their position on Taiwan is at stake, they will pay whatever price they have to pay economically in order to protect, as they see it, their political and strategic interests. And I think the outbreak of World War I demonstrates the same thing, that trade and economic interdependence can be something of a break on conflict, but it's not an impermeable barrier. It's a consideration, no more than that. No, go look. During the Cold War stayed cold for 40 years because of deterrence, largely. Nuclear weapons were a real dampener. It was also a bipolar world. You had two sets of decision makers. You had a degree of diplomacy to structure things, arms control. That ended 30 years ago. And since then, we've seen a real diffusion and dispersion of capability, many more countries with all sorts of capacity, greater political independence. There's many, many centers now of decision-making around the world. It's a much more difficult world to corral, a much more difficult world to keep under control. And you've got not just these kinds of traditional conflicts or potential conflicts and frictions between countries, but then you've got the whole overlay again of global issues. You can't deal with climate change through nuclear deterrence. It's apples and oranges. So we need a whole new dimension, if you will, of diplomacy to deal with these global issues. So this is a tougher period of history, actually. I mean, I didn't think that would be the case, when I was living in early on during the Cold War, but that is the case. That this is actually a much more demanding period for statecraft. Again, because you've got this diffusion or dispersion of capacity. You've got far more centers of decision making. You've got a degree of turbulence in the world that we didn't have. You've got all these global issues. We don't have a lot of rules and norms in place. The institutions in place that we inherited from the Cold War are clearly inadequate. They were never intended for the purposes that they're being put. So this is a real challenge, and I think the challenge is, can we successfully deal with if you will, the familiar kinds of challenges, great power rivalry and the like, and can come up with new arrangements and institutions to deal with all the global ones. So far, we're failing on both. U.S.-Chinese relations have clearly deteriorated significantly over the last couple of years. And on issues like climate change or proliferation or cyberspace or global health, it'd be real hard to sit here and make the case that things are getting better. If anything, we're losing out. Look, the good news, this can change. There's nothing about this that's inevitable. There's nothing about this that's impossible. My argument is not to be defeatist, but my argument is to take it seriously and to realize this won't get better by itself. And the United States has got to play a significant part, not by itself, not unilaterally, but it probably won't happen without us. We have got to be part of the answer. The old line, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Well, that applies to foreign policy at this point.
Okay. And maybe just a follow-up to it. Two questions are fairly related. Just to touch upon what you just mentioned. Elizabeth asks, due to poor U.S. statecraft, presently, is it true today that diplomacy will not be able to keep up with what's necessary? What are the consequences? And Ian asks, somewhat similar to that, Dr. Haass notes that America is abdicating its leadership role, but is the suggestion that this abdication is irreversible? In other words, can subsequent administrations regain this leadership and kind of, America's role in the world?
Look, both good questions related. There's still, history's not written. There's a tremendous scope for what could happen. At the beginning of our conversation, Ronan, I actually feel we're at a moment of history where things could go lots of different ways. And so you could get worried about that for good reason, but also people should take heart from that. Nothing's baked in. Nothing's for whatever your metaphor is, frozen in concrete or whatever one says in Texas. Positive things can still happen. And I've worked in enough situations where I've seen people in government accomplish wonderful things. So I still believe what can be done. I don't feel that one should in any way be defeatist about it. And I've now talked so long, I forgot the second half of the question.
It was, they were similar. Basically, the role of U.S. diplomacy is it maybe if it hasn't been enough, can that be resurrected and enough to do that? Yeah.
Look, I don't think you can ever wind the clock back. So when people talk about going back, people who like the Trump foreign policy talk about going back to where we were before. That's not an option. History doesn't permit that. Things have changed. North Korea is more powerful. China's more assertive. Russia is what it is. Climate change is what it is. So you can't walk back the clock. You can't unwind things. You have to understand, though, that let's say two other things. One is you don't want to do that either. that things were not perfect 3.5 years ago or 5 years ago. Things like climate change or terrorism or proliferation were already beginning to spin out of control so much. So what we still need to do is come up with global arrangements that deal with global challenges. So that's not an issue for bringing back the past. That's an issue of advancing American foreign policy and international cooperation. So we have to look through the windshield, not through the rear view mirror there. But I do think though some things can change for the better. I mean, for example, I'll take one area. I think obviously our most important relationships in the world are with our allies, basic security arrangements. But as we talked about a few minutes ago, those are our partners for dealing with regional and global challenges. I think we could dramatically revive our alliances and our relationships around the world with real consultations, stop beating up on them on questions of burden sharing, listen to their views a bit more, work with them on certain common challenges. I actually think and stop acting unilaterally. Over the last few years, we have acted unilaterally on any number of issues. So a real commitment to working together, if at all possible, I think would help. So in the back of their minds, they may still not see us quite the same way. I understand that. But could we dramatically improve the quality of these relationships? Absolutely.
And I suppose somewhat related to that, Stephen says, I love your book. I'm curious about your thoughts on Russian and Chinese disinformation and how this relates to how we should deal with each of them and how our citizens understand our relationship with each and each other.
China, I don't think it's a big part of Chinese foreign policy. We've seen a few things at the beginning of the pandemic. We've had some spokesmen talk about truly ridiculous things, that the U.S. Army was spreading certain things that was inacceptable and unacceptable. But that doesn't seem to be the day-to-day bread and butter of Chinese foreign policy. For Russia, though, it is much more. What Russia's doing is essentially trying to change the context in which American democracy plays out. And what they've done is obviously trying to get inside social media and try to magnify or intensify certain trends that tend to make it much harder for Americans to come together, that reinforce some of the divides in our society, be they along political lines, racial lines, whatever. So Russia's playing a truly unhelpful role there. I find it unacceptable. So one approach is sanctions. The other approach is to pressure, to think about what we could do to put pressure on Russian politics. Mr. Putin cares clearly about one thing, which is his maintaining power. His plan is to do it for decades to come. Well, I think there are things we can do potentially to put pressure on him if he's going to interfere in our politics. Ultimately, I'd like to have a world, going back to where we began our conversation, where there's a little bit of a respect for borders. Borders are not just things you shouldn't roll tanks across. Borders have got to be places, ideally, where you would not interfere in one another's politics. Now, that sounds great, and let me be the first to admit, if we criticize what China's done in Hong Kong, we would consider that to be perfectly appropriate. China would consider that to be interference in its internal politics. So, like everything else in life, this will be extraordinarily hard to negotiate and then implement, because we do have such fundamentally different views about human rights and the rest. But there ought to be certain things that are off limits, or if someone disagrees, they ought to pay a price for it. Mr. Putin ought to pay a price for it.
And I just three questions here related to China. One, Nitin asks, if the U.S. continues to step back and countries are still dependent upon external capital, especially in the developing world, one, will China have much more influence globally since they are willing to provide capital to these nations? And is there a risk that the U.S. dollar loses its status as a reserve currency?
Well, in the first half of that, China is trying to do renminbi or yuan diplomacy through Belt and Road and other things. It's talking about forgiving some loans now as a way to cultivate goodwill. And then, for example, when it pressures countries to side with it on Hong Kong, it's no coincidence. Look, my view is we can complain about it all we want, but we won't accomplish anything unless we get in the game. And that's where trade policy, investment policy, aid policy all come in. So if we don't like what China's doing, the answer is offer countries something better. We're going to have an opportunity. Imagine we develop a vaccine in this country. Some company does. Well, are we going to make it available to the rest of the world? If so, when? On what terms? That would be a way, shall we say, to cultivate an awful lot of goodwill if we're prepared to think creatively. This question about the dollar is very interesting. Big debate among economists. The dollar has played this central role, as you know, for really since World War II. It's given us tremendous advantages. What Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called it exorbitant privilege. It gives us great flexibility. It reduces pressures on us if we run deficits and debt. All transactions are denominated in dollars. The question is whether the world will live with this, and there's forever. And there's a couple of reasons that they may be getting tired of it. One is there's real doubts about American competence. Looking at the virus, there's real doubts about the independence of the Federal Reserve because there's been so much pressure placed on Mr. Powell. American indebtedness is enormous. I mean, I read the other day that it went up nearly $1 trillion in a single month. It's this year, so probably rack up another 5 or so trillion this year in debt. So the question is, will the world feel comfortable having the dollar play such a basic role given all this? Plus, you're beginning to have alternatives. Obviously, you've got other currencies, you've got cryptocurrencies. So my own view is that, we will probably at some point move to a world of where the dollar's dominance will be reduced. I don't think it's replaced. I think it is reduced, but that'll put more pressure on us. And right now, we have the luxury of really low interest rates. So even if you have enormous debt, what it costs to service the debt is relatively modest because the borrowing rates are so small. But at the rate we are accumulating debt, a small uptick in interest rates could have a significant impact on our budget and crowd out all sorts of other useful spending. And I think we've put ourselves in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. And what I'm worried about, it's a question of when and not if the bill will come due for that. And I think I don't think we are at all thinking long term about, or to put it another way, here in Texas, the United States has done extraordinary things to reduce and really eliminate our energy vulnerability and dependencies. I worry that we're now replacing or substituting dollar degree of currency vulnerability there.
And just to kind of follow up, 2 questions related to China. Richard asks, what should be kind of our basic understandings that we should have about our relationship with China going forward? And then someone else asks kind of a more specific question: should the U.S. establish a permanent military base in Taiwan as a deterrent?
Look, there's 3 big debates going on about China. There's one about what's going on in China, how strong is China internally, economically, politically, so forth. And there's a big range of views. Second of all, a debate about the scope of China's ambitions. What's China's definition of success? What are they trying to do in the region and the world? How ambitious, expansive are they? And then thirdly, what should we do about it? My own view is we probably exaggerate some of their strengths and underestimate some of their difficulties. My own view is their ambitions are significant but limited, but they have clearly become much more assertive in recent months, either because they think this is a moment of opportunity because we're distracted, or because they're looking to distract their own people from their economic slowdown and their problems with the virus, or both. And when I think about what we want with China, my own view is we need to push back where necessary, whether it's the South China Sea, Taiwan, India, what have you. On the other hand, we want a relationship with China where we protect the possibility or the reality of limited cooperation on areas of mutual interest, be it climate change, be it global health, be it North Korean proliferation, be it Afghanistan. And that's tricky. That's going to take a degree of dexterity and deftness diplomatically, and we'll see if both sides are up to it. But I would look, this is the defining relationship of this era of history. What happens will be consequential by any and every measure. And in the last few years, this relationship has lost a lot of altitude. And by the way, I don't think any of this changes significantly based upon what happens in November. The Trump administration has been all over the place with China. It's put a lot of emphasis, I think, incorrectly on a limited trade agreement. I think it's a Biden administration. They'll probably be tougher on human rights. Might be tougher on certain strategic issues. Might be less focused on getting access to China's market. Might be more focused on dealing with certain issues on technology. So I think this is a difficult relationship, regardless. There's now, as the Webster's Dictionary has now said, irregardless of what happens this November. Up, you're freezing
Not
again.
exactly your purview. But Arlene asks, how important do you think it is for Biden to pick a woman of color for his running mate? And more broadly, what characteristics do you think would be important to look for in Biden's choice? Or really kind of what do you think is important to be effective for any vice president?
Well, he's already declared publicly that he's going to choose a woman as his vice president. Look, there's so many talented women he could choose from in the Democratic firmament, and there's so many talented women of color he could choose from in the Democratic firmament that to me is it's just not a problem. It's not an issue. Well, look, there's a range of considerations when you choose a vice president. The most important is obviously someone who could be president. Second most important is someone who could be a real partner in governing. The vice president, in some ways, is the ultimate minister without portfolio. And he or she has usually lunch with the president on a regular basis. They're often the last person in the room. The meeting after the meeting, in many cases, is with the vice president. So it's important that it's a confidant, someone who can be a real sounding board. But look, I wasn't born yesterday. You also want someone who will help you get elected. And so, before you have the luxury of governing, you have the reality of politicking. And you've got to have someone who will strengthen the ticket and so forth. So, and the problem is that these considerations don't always necessarily, the arrows don't always line up and point to the same individual. But it's one of the most, if not the most important decision a candidate for president has to make. And I also think if we look at American history, we've seen a pattern where the last few vice presidents have become more significant. I don't know who, but Al Gore was significant with Bill Clinton, obviously Dick Cheney. And I don't have a great understanding of Mr. Pence's role. I don't mean that as criticism. It's harder for me to read it. And Joe Biden with Barack Obama. So I think the pattern is that as the demands on the executive branch have grown, that the vice president has taken on a larger kind of co-governing sort of role, whether sometimes he or she is given a specific portfolio, sometimes it's a general, again, minister without portfolio, confidant sort of role. Either way, I think it's an extraordinarily important decision. And also, it's often a revealing decision. It tells you something about what this candidate, what he values most.
And we'll just maybe do two more quick audience questions and then wrap it all up shortly. But Richard ask, could you comment on the administration's proposal to withdraw U.S. troops from Germany?
My enthusiasm for that is about zero. Look, you've got increased Russian pressure on Europe. Germany is the single most important country in Europe. Why would you want to pull the rug out there? Why would you want to tempt Mr. Putin? It reinforces the sense of that the automaticity of Article 5 in the NATO alliance isn't what it used to be or what it needs to be. And it just seems to me I can see no case for such a decision. And I hope if Mr. Biden does get elected, I would hope one of the first things he'd do would be to avoid that decision.
All right. And Don asks, we have witnessed unprecedented levels of integration in North America since the adoption of NAFTA in '94. Do you expect this process to continue? And do you expect to ever see a level of integration in North America comparable to Europe and the EU?
Interesting question. I think the integration can continue. Right now, you've got three leaders who are not on the same page, to put it bluntly. In Lopez Obrador, Trudeau, and Trump. So I think it would take more of an alignment of the leaders. The good news in a funny sort of way, though, is you got the USMCA through bipartisan support. The president calls NAFTA the worst agreement ever, and he portrays this as the greatest agreement ever. It's actually the difference between the two is maybe in the 10% range. It's not significant, but if that's what it takes to get bipartisan support, great. And I think it gives you a foundation. And I think it's really up to the leaders. Will it become as integrated as Europe? No. I think it'll have more, because Europe was integrated for a political purpose. The impetus of European integration was to make war unthinkable, bring so knit together Germany and France that, again, Europe would never again experience what it had experienced too often in its history. You don't have the political impetus in North America. What you have are more functional concerns about trade, about immigration, and so forth. So I actually think NAFTA was quite successful. And I think USMCA is what it is. But I think you'll have, again, selective cooperation. For example, on certain types of security issues, it makes sense to cooperate because of North America being what it is. But you're not going to see a degree of political integration. There's no historical either impulse or rationale for
that. And lastly, I suppose this is an incredible book, and again, I highly recommend it to a lot of people. We're thinking of maybe perhaps incorporating some version of it for our student programs again once we're able to resume those. Maybe if you could just touch upon again what you would like Americans and the broader beyond that people to get out of it. When it comes to foreign policy and elections, the president has a degree of control and authority far beyond what he has in domestic issues or budgetary issues. Why is it so important for Americans to really have a decent understanding of what's going on in the world and what we're doing? And ultimately, if Americans have a great disagreement about American foreign policy, should we just look ourselves in the face, say, well, we elected X or we elected Y, and we kept them in power?
The reason that it matters so much is because the world matters so much. And there's virtually no aspect of life here in the United States that is unaffected by developments elsewhere. Again, you need someone now from outside Texas to tell people in Texas that. Look at the implications of what began in Wuhan. 9/11 killed 3,000 people in a day. Climate change has the potential to change where and how we and how we live. The economics of living in a global world are fundamental, whether it's things we sell or things we buy. Immigration obviously has tremendous impact on not just on our society, but on our economy. So, what happens in the world matters. But the flip side of that's also true. What the United States does and doesn't do in the world matters. So what I want people to come away with is a sense this is a loop. Things out there affect things here, but what it is we do and what it is we don't do affect the world. And so there's a organic relationship. And again, the impact of the world on us is significant. The impact of us on the world is significant. Now, the details of what it is we do then therefore have tremendous implications. That's the realm of foreign policy. And I want people to get smarter about it. I think, I'm old-fashioned, as I said before, and I tend to think you get better policy when more Americans are informed and more Americans demand good policy from those who they elect and the people they elect appoint. And if you put a spotlight on the decisions of government, that I believe increases the odds you get better policy. And also, we're not just talking about government. You can have a tremendous impact joining a non-governmental organization. Look at what's going on around the world with refugee issues or medical issues. Or you could go into the military. You can go into the CIA. There's so many ways you can make a difference in business, in journalism. So whether you're simply involved in the world as an informed citizen, or you're involved in the world professionally, it seems to me it's so clearly in your interest to learn more about it, particularly for young people. Think about it. If you're in high school or college now and you live, God willing, a normal life, your life will be a 21st century life. If you were, you will be here for most, if not all, of the century. Well, okay, then get up to speed on it. It's going to have an impact on you, and you should try to have an impact on it. And I don't. That may seem crazy, but I in all sorts of ways, whether it's personal decisions, business decisions, career decisions, political decisions, who you vote for, and so forth, that will have an impact. And again, the reason I wrote this is I want to help give people some of the tools, some of the background. I don't tell people what to think. Let me make that clear. I want them to come to their own conclusions, but I want them to work their way through it from a basis of a greater knowledge of history, the regions of the world, the global challenges, and a better feel for how the world works.
Well, wonderful way to finish it with a bit of optimism, at least. There's a lot of what we're talking about isn't always that optimistic, but definitely, recommend the book. I think a lot of people can learn a lot, and it's also nice to have it all put together in one place. And again, Dr. Haass, I want to thank you again for your service to the country and your continued service to the United States and beyond in terms of keeping us informed and engaged. And thank you so much for joining the council again. And we'd be delighted to host you again in Houston at some point, maybe next year, when hopefully we're all back in person. And thank you again for all that you do. And thank you very much for everything with the Council on Foreign Relations.
Thank you, Ryan. I hope you and your colleagues and everyone on this stays safe and stays well, given the circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.